3 weeks before she would watch the cold CEO of Vance Capital walk away from his own wedding, Iris Calloway was hired by his mother over a 4-minute phone call to plan it. The bride was a Hartley. The flowers had already been chosen. The first dance was scheduled for 8:15, golden hour light. The previous planner had resigned. There was no time, no margin, no second draft. There was only Iris, in a borrowed cab with her sample case, on her way to meet a man whose face appeared on the cover of every financial magazine and the cover of no human one. The first thing Iris Calloway noticed about Vance Tower was that nobody smiled in the lobby. The marble was the color of pale honey, the elevators were brushed bronze, and the woman behind the front desk wore a headset and an expression that suggested she had not slept since November. When Iris said her name, the woman tapped a screen, glanced up only once and said, 47th floor. Thank you, Iris said, because her mother had raised her to thank everyone, even people who would not look at her. She rode the elevator alone, holding her sample case against her hip the way a child holds a school report on a hard day. The elevator was lined with smoked glass that turned her own reflection into something softer than she felt, and the floors clicked past in small, unobtrusive numbers above the buttons, and somewhere a low chime sounded twice between the 20th and the 31st floor, and she thought, briefly and irrelevantly, of how strange it was that the very rich preferred their elevators silent and their sound systems imitating silence. She had been hired 3 hours earlier by a stranger over a phone call that lasted 4 minutes. The stranger had introduced herself as Helena Vance, and she had said, in a voice as smooth and cool as slate, "My son's wedding is in 3 weeks. The previous planner has resigned. You will report to Vance Tower at 4 o'clock. Do not be late." Iris had not been late. Iris was almost never late. But she had spent the cab ride trying to remember everything she knew about Sebastian Vance, the cold CEO whose face appeared on the cover of every financial magazine and the cover of no human one. And the answer was, not enough. He was 32. He ran his late father's firm with what one columnist had called monastic precision. He had been engaged for 7 months to Camille Hartley, the only daughter of the Hartley shipping family, and they had been photographed together at 3 galas and 0 ordinary places. He looked, in those photographs, like a man holding his breath. The 47th floor smelled faintly of cedar and printed paper. A young assistant in a charcoal suit met her at the elevator and said, "Miss Calloway, Mr. Vance is in his office. Mrs. Vance is on her way up. Please follow me." "Mrs. Vance?" Iris asked. "The mother or the bride?" "The mother," he said quickly, as if the second possibility had not yet been allowed. He led her down a corridor lined with framed black and white photographs of bridges, all of them taken from the river looking up, all of them giving the impression of being held aloft by something the camera could not see. At the end of the corridor was a door of dark walnut, and behind the door was a room walled in glass on 3 sides, and behind the glass was the city. 10 million windows glinting in the late afternoon sun, and in the center of all that light was a man at a desk who did not look up when they entered. "Sebastian," the assistant said, "the wedding planner." Sebastian Vance set down his pen. He stood. He was tall, but it was not the height that struck her. It was the stillness. He held himself the way a tree holds itself in the moment before snow. His suit was dark gray. His tie was a quieter gray, and his eyes, when he finally raised them to meet hers, were the color of a winter lake at the hour the wind drops. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Mr. Vance?" He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please." She sat. He sat. The assistant left. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the building, which is the sound a great deal of money makes when it is trying very hard to be quiet. "My mother has explained the situation," he said. "In 4 minutes, yes." The corner of his mouth moved, the smallest possible movement. It was not a smile. It might have been the memory of a smile. "I will not waste yours. The wedding is in 3 weeks. The venue is the Hartley estate in East Hampton. The guest list is 612. The previous planner resigned because my mother is, in her own words, exacting. That isn't usually the word other planners use. They use other words, he said, in private. Iris bent her head over her notebook to hide the small surprise of his honesty. And what would you like the wedding to be like, Mr. Vance? He considered the question for so long that she began to suspect he had not been asked it before. Finally, he said, Done. Done. On the day, on the hour, without scandal, without delay. Done. That isn't a wedding, she said gently. That is an event. He looked at her then, really looked. She felt the look the way one feels weather. Miss Calloway, he said, I have been engaged for 7 months and asked exactly that question once before by a journalist. Even she lost interest in the answer. I won't lose interest. She had not meant to say it. It had come out as a small flag of professional pride, and she heard it as soon as it was in the air, and she watched it land between them on the polished walnut. Sebastian Vance did not move, but something in his face moved. He looked at her the way a man looks at a window after months of looking at his own desk. The door opened. Sebastian, said Helena Vance. She entered the room the way a flag enters a room. She was tall and straight, and her hair was the color of ash. She wore navy. She wore pearls. She did not look at Iris. This is Miss Calloway, Sebastian said. I assumed. Helena crossed to the window, and she stood with her back to both of them, and she said, 3 weeks, Miss Calloway. The Hartleys are not patient people. Camille is not a patient person. Sebastian, of course, is patience itself, but Sebastian is not the one whose mother will telephone me every morning at 6. Do we understand one another? Yes, Mrs. Vance. My son will be available on alternate evenings between 7 and 9. Camille will be available exactly when she chooses. The dress fitting is Thursday. The venue inspection is Saturday. The flowers are a question of personal taste, by which I mean my taste. By which I mean I have already chosen them. White peonies, cream roses, ivory. Nothing that smells like anything. She paused. Are you taking notes, Miss Calloway? I am listening, Mrs. Vance. The notes will be more useful when I know what your son and his bride want. The room went very still. Helena Vance turned, slowly, and looked at Iris for the first time. Her gaze had the quality of a small, well-honed instrument that had been kept in a velvet-lined drawer. What an interesting answer, she said. What an interesting young woman to give it. She crossed to the door. Sebastian, walk me out. Mother! Now, please. He went. The door closed behind them. Iris sat alone in the glass room and listened to her own pulse, and tried to decide whether she had just lost a contract or earned one. When Sebastian came back in, he was holding 2 paper cups of coffee. He set one in front of her without asking. He sat down. He took a long, slow breath that she had the strange sense was the first real breath he had drawn that afternoon. You have the contract, Miss Calloway. Thank you. My mother thinks you are insolent. I am sorry. Don't be. He looked at the city. He looked at her. It is the first interesting word she has used in this house in a year. He pushed the coffee a little closer to her. Cream, no sugar. My assistant told me. Now please tell me what you would like to ask my fiancé and me when she arrives. Iris picked up her pen, and she felt, for the first time since the elevator, that she was on solid ground. Iris had read 3 profiles of Camille Hartley on her phone in the back of the cab on the way uptown. She had read a 4th on the elevator, and a 5th, the longest and most useful one, in the moment between Helena Vance saying, "You have the contract," and Sebastian Vance returning with 2 paper cups of coffee. The longest profile had been written for a glossy quarterly the year before, by a journalist who had spent 6 weeks shadowing Camille across 2 continents and 3 charity fundraisers. The journalist had described Camille as a person of unusual professional poise, an heiress who had not been raised to be loved so much as photographed, and who had, the journalist suspected, made her peace with that arrangement long ago. The article had used the word formidable 4 times, the word warm 0 times, and the word lonely once, in the very last paragraph, almost by accident, in a sentence the journalist had probably believed she was correcting at the time, but had instead, by leaving in, written more honestly than the rest of the piece. Iris had thought of the word lonely as the elevator climbed. She had thought of it again as Helena's heels echoed away down the corridor. She had thought of it for the 3rd time when the door opened and Camille Hartley arrived. Camille Hartley arrived 26 minutes late, which Iris suspected was either a personal best or a personal worst, depending on whose calendar you consulted. She came through the door the way certain women come into rooms they intend to own. Slowly, with a small smile, with sunglasses pushed up into hair the color of polished oak. She was beautiful. She was, in fact, the kind of beautiful that arrives in a room before its owner. Her dress was the soft white of magnolia petals, and her shoes were the color of nothing, and she carried a quilted bag the size of a small briefcase, as if it weighed nothing at all. "Sebastian," she said, kissing the air beside his cheek. "I am sorry. Traffic on the bridge." "Of course," he said, and Iris noticed that his eyes did not change. "And you must be Calloway." Camille extended a hand and gave Iris a smile that was very pretty and very brief. "Mother said you were small." "She was right," Iris said pleasantly. "I like small. Small is decisive." Camille sat without being asked, crossed her legs, and looked around the room as if appraising the furniture. "Now, 3 weeks. Tell me you can do 3 weeks." "I have done 3 weeks, Miss Hartley." 3 weeks for 612 people. "Yes." "You sound very confident." "I sound very prepared." Camille laughed. It was a pretty laugh, like glass. "Sebastian, I like her. Don't you like her?" "She is preferable to the last one," Sebastian said quietly. "Well, that is a very low bar." Camille leaned forward. "Calloway, listen carefully. I do not want a wedding. I want photographs. The wedding is what happens around the photographs. The Hartleys are launching 3 properties this year, and the press will be looking for any reason to write about my husband's family or mine, and I would prefer that they write what we tell them to write. So, the aisle is to be long, the flowers are to be tall, the cake is to be photogenic. The ceremony itself is to be timed to the golden hour, between 6:12 and 6:28, because anything earlier looks tired, and anything later looks desperate. The first dance follows later, by candlelight, when the room is soft. Is that achievable?" Iris glanced, very briefly, at Sebastian. He was looking at his hands. "Miss Hartley," she said, "everything you have asked for is achievable." "Excellent. May I ask one question of my own?" "You may ask anything in 3 weeks, except for changes to my schedule." "What would make the day," Iris said, "feel like yours? Not the families, not the Hartleys. Yours and Mr. Vance's. The 2 of you." There was a small, sharp silence. Camille recovered first, and she did it with grace. "Iris," she said, with an emphasis that was not quite cruel. "The day already feels like ours. We do not require feelings to be planned for us. That, surely, is what we are paying you not to do." Iris smiled. She put her pen down. She turned slightly to address them both. "Miss Hartley, Mr. Vance, I will plan the day you have described. I will plan it so well that the photographers will write essays about it. I will plan it so the golden hour holds its breath for 8 extra minutes if I have to bribe the sun. But I will also plan, quietly, in the spaces between the photographs, a single hour that is yours. A single hour that does not contain the press or the parents or the partners. I include that hour in my fee. You may use it, you may decline it, but it will be there, on the schedule, marked simply as personal. Camille blinked. Sebastian said, very softly, "Thank you, Miss Calloway." "Of course." Camille stood. "Well, I am late for the next thing. Sebastian, walk me down. Calloway, the dress fitting is at Bergdorf's on Thursday at 10. Do not be late, and do not have an opinion." She kissed the air beside Sebastian again and was gone. When the door closed, Sebastian sat down again. He folded his hands. He looked at them as if they belonged to a stranger. "An hour that is ours," he repeated. "Yes. In 3 weeks of 612 people. Yes." He did not look up. "Miss Calloway," he said, "have you ever seen a man drown in plain sight?" She did not answer. She did not have to. "That hour," he said. "That hour is the kindest thing anyone has offered me in this house. Please plan it. I will not use it, but please plan it." She went home that night, and she sat on the small balcony of her small apartment in Park Slope, and she watched the lights of the bridges come on, one by one. And she thought about the man who had asked her to plan an hour he would not use. And she thought about the woman who had told her not to have an opinion. And she thought about the mother whose face had been a small, polished instrument of judgment. And she thought, in the clear, quiet way she had thought all her life, "I am going to do this job beautifully, because it is the only thing in that whole tower that is not afraid of itself." Then she made herself a cup of tea, and she opened her laptop, and she began to plan a wedding. Calloway Weddings occupied 2 rooms above a bakery on 5th Avenue in Brooklyn, and the bakery was the reason Iris had taken the lease. She had walked in on the open house morning, smelled the cardamom and butter rising through the floorboards, and signed the papers within the hour. Her mother had laughed when she heard, "You will not get any work done above a bakery, Iris." Her mother had been wrong about that, and right, very gently, about almost everything else. The 2 rooms had been a tailor's once, and before that a small dental practice, and before that something forgotten by everyone except the building's super, who could remember everything but only rarely chose to. Iris had painted the walls the colour of cream a long time before she could afford to paint them at all, and she had hung, on the front room wall, a single framed quotation from a 20th century designer, which read, "A wedding is not a transaction. A wedding is a sentence the family will speak aloud at every Christmas for 40 years. She kept the quotation under glass because she liked the way the light caught it on rainy afternoons. And she kept it where the brides could see it, because brides, more than anyone she had ever planned for, needed to be reminded that what they were planning was not a single afternoon, but a sentence. The back room held a tall, white workbench, 3 corkboards covered in fabric swatches, 2 filing cabinets, a small refrigerator that contained mostly apples and the occasional bottle of champagne Felix had hidden from himself, and a long oak table that had once belonged to Iris's grandmother, and that Iris had hauled up 2 flights of stairs at 24 and refused, ever after, to part with. The table had a small chip in one corner, where her grandmother had once dropped a cast-iron skillet, and Iris had decided, on the day she set up the office, never to repair the chip, because the chip was the place from which her grandmother's hand had once let go, and she did not believe in repairing the places where the women who had raised you had once let go. Felix had walked in for his interview on the 2nd day of the office's existence, and had taken one look at the chipped corner of the table and said, "I will work for whatever you can afford." And Iris had hired him before he had taken his coat off. He had been with her for 5 years now, and the only thing she had ever paid him in full was loyalty, and he had paid her back with the same currency, in sums she had long since stopped counting. Felix Ramirez was already at his desk when she came in the next morning, holding a paper cup of black coffee in one hand and 3 printed magazine spreads in the other. Felix was 30, built like a swimmer, dressed like a magazine, and possessed of the rarest professional virtue Iris knew. He could be told the truth, and asked to keep it. "Tell me everything," he said. 612 people. 3 weeks. Hartley Estate. The bride wants photographs. The mother has chosen the flowers. The groom asked me to plan an hour of personal time he will not use. Felix put down his coffee. Iris. I know. Iris. I know, Felix. You took it. I took it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down, unscrewed the cap of his pen with his teeth, and said, All right. Run me through what we have. That was Felix. That was, Iris thought, the gift of a person who treated your impossible decisions as an entry on a list. They worked through the morning. By noon they had a venue diagram, a timeline drawn in pencil, a draft seating chart with the words diplomatic risk in 3 places, and a list of vendors that read like the credits of a small film. By 2, Iris had on her desk a folder marked Vance/Hartley and a folder marked Vance/Hartley/personal, and the second folder had only one piece of paper inside it, on which she had written, in her steady schoolteacher hand, 1 hour, sunset, private, optional. She would not show that paper to anyone. Not Felix, not Helena, not Camille, especially not Sebastian. She would simply hold it open, the way one holds a door open, and wait to see whether anyone walked through. The first venue inspection was that Saturday. The Hartley estate sat on 12 acres of East Hampton meadow, and the meadow ran down to a stretch of beach where the Atlantic was a thin grey line on a flat morning. The main house was white, 3 stories, columned in front and gardened in back. And the gardens were the kind of gardens that English novelists once described, and Hamptonites now hired to be described again. Iris arrived in a hired car at 9. Felix came in his own car at 9:03, because he did not believe in being chauffeured to other people's lawns. Sebastian was already there. He was alone, on the back terrace, a coffee in one hand, no jacket, his shirt cuffs rolled to the elbow. The sleeves did not match the tower. The morning sun did not match the tower either. He looked, against the meadow and the sea, like a man on furlough from a country whose name he had forgotten. Mr. Vance. Miss Calloway. This is Felix Ramirez, my right hand. Mr. Ramirez. Mr. Vance, sir, said Felix in his most polished voice, and Iris had the brief, irrelevant satisfaction of seeing Sebastian's mouth move toward what might have been a smile. Where is Miss Hartley? Felix asked. Miss Hartley sends her regrets. Of course, Felix said. Of course she does. They walked the property. Iris walked it with her eyes, Felix with his phone, Sebastian with his hands in his pockets, and an expression that made Iris want to ask him every 20 paces whether he had remembered breakfast. She did not ask. She measured the lawn instead. She checked the wind. She stood on the spot where the aisle would run and looked back toward the house, and she said quietly, 6:12. The light will be exactly there, on that line, between the second and third columns. Camille will be backlit. The photographers will weep. 6:12, Sebastian repeated. To 6:28. And then? Cocktails, dinner, toasts. First dance at 8:15. By then the room will be candlelit, the guests will be soft with wine, and the photographs will already be in the lab. He nodded. He did not, she noticed, ask about the first dance. They walked back to the terrace. Felix went off to call the catering manager. Sebastian and Iris stood for a moment in the early light, and the sea air was salt and grass, and something cool that might have been the morning's last fog. And Sebastian said, without looking at her, May I ask you a question, Miss Calloway? Yes? How many weddings have you planned? 89? And of those 89, how many ended in marriages that lasted? She considered him. The question was not unkind. It was, she thought, the most genuine thing he had asked anyone in months. I do not know about all of them, Mr. Vance. I know about the 71 for whom we still bake the anniversary cake at the bakery downstairs from my office. They are still married, some of them quite happily. Some of them are still trying. That is what marriages are, a thing you keep trying. 71 of 89. Yes. And the others? They are doing whatever was right for them, Mr. Vance. Not every wedding I have planned was a marriage that needed to last. He turned to her, slowly, carefully. He looked at her with that lake-grey gaze, and he said, "Miss Calloway, are you telling me something?" "I am answering your question." "Are you?" "I am answering," she said, "exactly the question you asked. If you would like to ask a different question, you may." He held her eye for a long moment, and she felt the morning wind on her neck. And then he looked back at the sea, and he said, 6:12. That is the time of the light. Yes. Thank you, Miss Calloway. He did not ask the other question. But she had seen, very briefly, the place behind his face where the other question lived. She drove back to the city with Felix, and Felix turned the radio off after 20 minutes, and he said, without preamble, "Iris. Don't. Iris. Felix, please. I'm going to say one thing, and then I'm going to stop. He looks at you the way men look at maps when they are lost. That is not a feeling. That is a fact about how light falls on his face when you are talking. I'm not telling you what to do with it. I'm telling you, as your friend, that I saw it, and I would not be a friend if I did not say so. He is engaged, Felix. I know. In 3 weeks. I know. To one of the most photographed women in the country. Iris, I know." She looked out the window. The Long Island Expressway was the way it always was on Saturday afternoons. A slow, grey river of people who had also gone somewhere green for the morning. She watched a station wagon pass them, with 3 children in the back, and one of them was laughing at something out of frame. And Iris felt, for one foolish second, the wish to be in that car, and not in this one. "All right," she said. "All right, what?" "All right, you have said it. Now stop." Felix stopped. But that night, in her apartment, she opened the personal folder on her laptop, the one with the single sheet of paper that read, 1 hour, sunset, private, optional. And she stared at it for a long time, and she did not add to it, and she did not delete it. And at last she closed the laptop, and she made herself dinner, and she watched a film she had seen before, because she could not bear that night the idea of being surprised. The next 2 weeks moved the way wedding weeks move, quickly, expensively, and in 17 directions at once. Iris did not sleep enough. She slept, but not enough. She slept the kind of sleep wedding planners learn to take in the 3rd year of the work, which is the sleep of a woman who has trained her body to fold a full night's rest into 4 hours, and to recover the rest of it in flashes during taxi rides and waiting room minutes. She kept a small canvas tote on the back of her office chair, but contained, at any moment, a toothbrush, a cardigan, a clean blouse, 3 pens of varying ink, a pair of flat shoes, a granola bar, a roll of gaffer's tape, an envelope of safety pins, a tin of mints, and the complete contact list of the catering, lighting, floral, and stationery firms within an hour's drive of the East Hampton Bridge. The tote was the 3rd such tote she had owned. She had retired the first 2 when their handles had given out, and she would retire this one, eventually, with the same quiet gratitude one retires a horse that has carried one a long distance over uneven ground. The wedding industry, she sometimes thought, was the work of converting infinite possibility into one specific Saturday. Most brides did not understand that they were not buying flowers and music and chairs. They were buying a single Saturday in which the universe of possible Saturdays narrowed, gently, to the one they had asked for. The work of the planner was not to choose for them. The work of the planner was to keep the funnel narrowing on schedule, so that on the morning of the day, when the bride opened her eyes, there was nothing left to decide, except whether to say yes when the question came. For the Vance Hartley wedding, the funnel was narrowing very fast indeed. There was, Iris had noticed by the 2nd day of the contract, a particular kind of quiet that descended on the rooms in which old families chose to gather. It was not silence, because there was always music or staff or the low hum of expensive appliances, but it was a quiet in which nothing genuine was ever said aloud. The Hartley women had perfected it. They walked through their own kitchens in it. They stood at their own front doors in it. They received guests in it, and they parted from those guests in it. And Iris had begun, in the second week, to suspect that the Hartleys had not exchanged a single sincere sentence under their own roof in something on the order of a generation. The Vance household had a different quiet. Sebastian's quiet was not performed, exactly. It was, Iris had come to understand, simply the long after-effect of a man having forgotten how to speak softly to anyone, including himself. He had inherited, on the Tuesday in February, when his father had gone away, a great deal more than a firm. He had inherited a posture and a vocabulary and a code of small habits about coats and watches and second sons, all of it useful for moving through public rooms, and none of it useful for the small rooms of one's own life. The dress fittings were at Bergdorf's, in a fitting room the size of a small ballroom, with Camille standing on a velvet step, and 3 seamstresses on their knees around her like supplicants at a small, perfect altar. Vivian Hartley, Camille's mother, sat on a velvet bench in a navy suit and watched Iris with a quiet, steady, museum-attendant attention that was somehow worse than rudeness. "Miss Calloway," Vivian said on the 4th fitting, "you are very efficient." "Thank you, Mrs. Hartley. It is unusual in a woman of your background." Iris looked up from her clipboard. She kept her face still, but she felt Felix freeze beside her. "My background, Mrs. Hartley." "You are from the Midwest?" "I am from Ohio, yes." "And your father was, what, a teacher?" "A high school physics teacher. My mother was a florist." "How charming." Vivian examined her own nails. "And yet you have built a small business that arranges other people's weddings. I find that fascinating. You arrange other people's biggest days. You yourself, presumably, have not yet had one. Tell me, do you find it lonely?" Camille, on the velvet step, looked over. She did not intervene. "I find it work, Mrs. Hartley," Iris said. "Most people do find their work work. Some people find it lonely. I do not. I find it the thing I do." She turned a page on her clipboard. "Mrs. Hartley, I would like to discuss the order of the toasts. Tomorrow, perhaps. Today, please." Vivian Hartley raised her eyebrows. Then she smiled. It was the smile of a person who has decided that an opponent is worth a second glance. "Today, then, Miss Calloway. By all means." That night Iris went home, and she sat on her balcony and she did not cry. Because she did not cry about other people's mothers. But she allowed herself a small, dry laugh in the dark. The help. She had been called the help, in not so many words, by a woman in a navy suit. And she had answered with a clipboard. And she would do it again tomorrow if asked. It did not matter. It had never mattered. What mattered was the day. She was wrong about that, but she did not know it yet. The note arrived the next morning by courier. It was on a heavy cream card. It said, in a hand she did not yet recognize, "Miss Calloway, I overheard the conversation in the fitting room. I am sorry I did not speak. I will speak the next time. S.V." She put the card in the inside pocket of her notebook. She did not show it to Felix. She did not show it to anyone. She carried it for the rest of the week. Sebastian was, by then, available on alternate evenings between 7 and 9, exactly as Helena had decreed, and Iris made the alternate evenings count. They sat in his glass office with take-out cartons of Thai food open between them, and binders open on the floor, and laptops balanced on knees, and they made decisions together about table runners and ice sculpture, and the speed at which the doors of the chapel tent would open behind the bride. He did not, after the first evening, look at his watch. He took his suit jacket off. He rolled his cuffs. He made small jokes that surprised them both. Once, around 8:45, he said, "Miss Calloway, you are ruining my reputation as a difficult man." And she laughed, and it was the laugh she had been swallowing for 10 days, and it filled the glass room and bounced off the windows. He laughed too, briefly, quietly, but he laughed. "Iris," she said.
"What?" "Iris. Off the clock, you may call me Iris. Calloway's for the press." He considered this. He considered it the way he had considered her question on the first day. Then he said, "Sebastian, off the clock. Vance is for the firm." "Sebastian." "Iris." It was nothing. It was a small exchange of names between two professionals. It was also, Iris knew, the smallest possible kind of door, opening the smallest possible amount. She did not tell Felix about that either. But Felix was Felix, and Felix saw her, and one evening, as they were closing up the office above the bakery, he said, lightly, as if asking about the weather, "Iris, are you in trouble?" "No." "Not yet." "Not yet." He sighed. He locked the door behind them. They walked together to the corner. Felix said, "I am here. Whatever you need." "I know. I have already prepared a speech." "Of course you have." "It is very moving." "I am sure it is." He smiled at her, and they parted at the subway, and Iris went home through the cool spring night, and she thought about the cream card in the inside pocket of her notebook, and she thought about a man who had said, "Please plan an hour I will not use." And she thought, very steadily, very quietly, "I will not use it either." Then she thought, "I will plan the most beautiful wedding I have ever planned, and then I will go home." She was wrong about that, too, but in a smaller way, and she would not know until the night before the wedding, when the lights went out at the rehearsal dinner. There were many things Iris would later remember about the 2 weeks before the rehearsal dinner, but the one she would remember longest was the small, repeated mercy of the alternate evenings. The mercy was not the work itself. The work was difficult, and the work was thankless, and the work involved phone calls to vendors who had been told, by other Hartleys and other Vances at other weddings, that the Hartleys and the Vances were not the kind of clients to be told no. The mercy was, instead, the simple shape of those evenings, the Thai food that Sebastian's assistant ordered without being asked, the way Sebastian rolled his cuffs back exactly 2 folds, never 1, never 3. The way he set the takeout containers on the binder of swatches and apologized to the binder, gravely, in advance for any oil that might transfer. The way he asked, on the 3rd evening, whether Iris had eaten lunch, and on the 5th, whether Felix had eaten lunch, and on the 7th, whether her mother in Ohio had eaten lunch, by which point the question had become a small joke between them that they did not bother explaining to anyone else. He told her, on the 4th evening, that his father had been gone for 8 years. He did not use the harder words. He used soft ones, and he used them sparingly. And he said only that the firm had become his on a Tuesday in February when he was 24, and that he had, on the way home from his father's office on that Tuesday, sat in the back of a town car and looked out at the river, and decided that grief was a thing you could not afford if you were also responsible for 212 employees. He had been wrong about that, he said quietly, and the wrongness of it had sat at the back of his chest for 8 years, like a stone he had agreed to carry, without ever asking how heavy it was. She told him, on the same evening, that her own father had been a high school physics teacher, that he had been gone for 11 years, and that she had learned what little she knew about precision from him. He had once spent 3 months teaching her, when she was 9, how to fold paper airplanes that flew the length of the gymnasium. He had told her, on the day she got her first one to land in the basketball hoop at the far end, that the secret of any beautiful thing was the patience to fold it 3 times more than you wanted to. Sebastian had listened to that the way he had listened to nothing else in the previous year of his life, which was to say, with the whole of his face. She had noticed that evening that listening was a thing he did the way some men did athletics, with all his weight and all his attention. She had thought, briefly, that he had probably had no one to listen to in a very long time. She had not said so. She had folded a napkin, instead, into a small paper crane, and she had placed the crane on the corner of his desk. And she had not told him about her father's airplanes. And she had said, 8:45, Mr. Vance. We have decisions left. The crane stayed on his desk. She noticed, on the next evening, that his cleaner had been instructed to leave it alone. The crane was still there on the 7th evening, and the 11th, and the 14th. And on the morning of the wedding she would think of it, briefly, as she walked across the rear lawn with her clipboard. And she would understand, even before she understood anything else, that the crane had become a small, private weather report between them. A flag that one of them had raised on a desk to say, in a language no one else in that tower spoke, I see you. I have been seeing you. I will continue to see you. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Hartley estate, in the larger of the two ballrooms, on the night before the wedding. It was a small affair by Hartley standards, which is to say there were 240 people seated at 20 round tables under a tent of strung lights, and the menu was simple, by which the Hartleys meant it had only 7 courses. Iris stood at the back of the tent in a black dress and flat shoes, with a clipboard, an earpiece, and Felix at her elbow. The wind was up off the sea, and the strung lights were swaying slightly, and Felix said, into his own earpiece, We're at 92%. Anything left in the box? The cake, Iris said. The lighting cue at 8:40, the sister's toast, the flower swap on table 16, and Helena Vance hasn't smiled all evening. Helena Vance hasn't smiled in 6 months. She smiled at the sommelier. That was for show. True. She was watching the head table when it happened. Sebastian was seated between Camille and Helena, with Vivian Hartley on Camille's other side, and the 4 of them looked like a tableau in an old painting, lacquered, lit, and not quite at peace with one another. Sebastian had not eaten his soup. He had not eaten the second course. He was answering Vivian's questions with the polite stillness of a man calculating an exit. Iris had been watching him for 40 minutes, without meaning to, and she made herself stop, the way one makes oneself stop watching a kettle. And she turned to her clipboard, and she noted the time, and the lights went out. All of them, at once. The strung lights, the chandeliers, the sconces, the candles on the round tables, not at all, of course, but every electric light on the property, gone. The way a held breath is gone. The tent was very dark and very quiet. Iris, Felix said. I am here. What do you need? Phones up. Every staff member, every server. Phones up, flashlights on, in a circle around the perimeter. Nobody runs, nobody panics. I'm going to the head table. She went. She moved through the dark by memory, the way she had moved through her own apartment for years before she had been able to afford a hallway light. She reached the head table. She bent slightly. She said, quietly, Mrs. Vance, Miss Hartley, Mr. Vance, Mrs. Hartley, we have lost power on the property. We will have generators on the lawn within 10 minutes. In the meantime, my staff is bringing additional candles, and the kitchen will continue with the cold courses on the next service. Please remain seated. The tent is safe. Where is the manager? Vivian snapped. I am the manager, Mrs. Hartley. The estate manager. The estate manager is at the generator. I have asked him to be. And the kitchen? Cooking by gas. The hot plates are gas as well. Service will resume in 3 minutes. There was a small, crystalline silence, and then Helena Vance said, very precisely, Thank you, Miss Calloway. Please proceed. Iris turned and went. Felix had already organized the staff into a soft, breathing ring of phone light around the tent perimeter, and the strung lights came back on at minute 8, and the chandeliers at minute 9, and the rest of the rehearsal dinner went forward, and only the people at the head table noticed that the soup course had been served by a woman holding a candelabrum she had taken from the front hall, and a wax-stained smile she had not asked her face to make. When the dinner ended, the guests drifted out toward their cars. The string quartet played the last bars of Something Tactful. Iris stood by the gravel drive with her clipboard, doing the wave-off, and Sebastian came out alone. He stopped beside her. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "You moved through that dark, like someone who had grown up in it." "I had. We could not always afford the lights. I would like to walk you to your car." I drove with Felix. "Then I would like to walk you to Felix's car." "All right." They walked across the lawn, away from the house. The grass was damp. The sea was a low, steady sound from somewhere behind the dunes. He walked on her left. He did not offer his arm. He kept his hands in his pockets. He looked at the ground. "Iris." "Yes?" "Tomorrow." "Yes." He stopped. He did not look at her. He spoke to the gravel, and his voice was low, and it had something in it that she had not heard in him before, which was the absence of all his careful stillness. "I do not want this wedding." She did not answer. She had not been asked a question. "I'm going to ask one thing of you, Iris, and it is not professional, and you do not have to answer, and you may dismiss me without consequence, and I will pretend I did not say it. Do you understand?" "I understand." "If, tomorrow, before the first dance, I were to do something foolish, something that would inconvenience 612 people, 2 families, 3 publicists, and the entire schedule on which you have built 3 weeks of your life, would I lose your respect?" She felt the question land, and she felt the night around it, and she felt how careful she had to be with what she said next, because what she said next might be the thing she remembered for the rest of her life, and she did not want to remember a lie. She said, "Sebastian, you will never lose my respect by choosing something true." He looked at her then. The light was bad. The night was almost moonless. But she saw his face. She saw the place behind his face. She saw the man who had asked her to plan an hour he would not use. And she saw, for the first time, that he had been planning an hour too. And she saw that the hour had moved into his eyes and stayed there, and was looking at her now, and did not blink. "Good night, Iris." "Good night, Sebastian." She walked the rest of the way to Felix's car alone. Felix did not say anything when she got in. He started the engine. He drove her home in silence. At her stoop, he turned the engine off, and he turned to her, and he said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I will be on your side." "Thank you, Felix." "Iris." "Yes." "I would like, very much, to know what you said to him on the lawn." "I told him the truth, Felix." "That is what I was afraid of." She kissed him on the cheek, and she went inside. And she did not sleep. And at 3 a.m. she got up, and she sat at her small kitchen table, and she wrote, in her steady, schoolteacher hand, a single sentence on a single sheet of paper, which she put inside the inside pocket of her notebook, beside the cream card. The sentence read, "An hour at sunset. Private. Optional." She would not show that paper to anyone, but she had written it twice now, and the second time she had not put a question mark. She did not sleep at all on the night before the wedding. She tried. She lay on her back in her small, dark bedroom and listened to the steam pipes ticking in the wall and the late traffic on the avenue and the soft, far-off rumble of a train somewhere across the borough. And she counted backwards from 1,000, which was a trick her father had taught her. And at 643, she stopped counting and got out of bed and made tea and stood at the window watching the city quietly pretend to sleep. She did not, she realized, want sleep. She wanted, more than anything, to stand at this window for a while and consider what she was about to walk into, and to consider what she might walk out of, and to consider, especially, the man who had asked her, on a lawn under a moonless sky, whether she would lose respect for him if he did something foolish. The honest answer, she thought, was that respect was not the right word. The honest answer was that she had not respected anyone the way she respected him in months. The honest answer
was that she had spent 3 weeks in a tower full of mirrors, learning to recognize, in one of those mirrors, a man who had been pretending to be a different man for so long that he had almost forgotten he was pretending, and that the recognition itself, the slow, unhurried act of seeing him, had become the most valuable thing she had done in a decade. She did not allow herself to follow the thought all the way down. She allowed it to stand at the kitchen window with her, and she allowed it to drink its tea. And at 4:30, she put on her black dress and her flat shoes, and she pinned her hair, and she picked up her clipboard, and she went out into the cool blue dark of the city to do, one final time, the work she had been hired to do. The morning of the wedding came up out of the sea like a pearl out of a hand. Iris was at the estate by 5. The sky was the colour of a clean shell, and the lawn was wet, and the staff were already there, 60 of them, in soft black, moving across the grass with trays and cables and rolled white runners. Felix was at the gate, with a clipboard the size of a small book. The flower truck was halfway up the drive. The chair rental was already laid out in the meadow in 24 soft white rows that curved like the inside of an ear. The arch under which Sebastian and Camille would say their vows was still draped in cloth at the back of the truck, and would not come out until 10, because Vivian Hartley did not believe in showing the arch to the morning. Iris took a breath of the salt air, and she put her hand on her clipboard and she said, in the voice she used on weddings, "All right, let us begin." She did not allow herself to think, for the first 6 hours, about the man on the lawn the night before, or the cream card in the inside pocket of her notebook, or the second sheet of paper she had written at 3 in the morning. She did her work. She moved through the day the way she had moved through the dark at the rehearsal dinner, by memory, by training, by the long, slow muscle of a person who had been keeping other people's promises for a living. By 8, the runners were laid. By 9, the candles were filled. By 10, the arch came out of the truck and was raised under the second and third columns of the rear terrace, exactly on the line where Iris had stood a week earlier and predicted the light. By 11, the orchestra arrived. By noon, the first guests were checked into the Hartley guest cottages. By 1, Camille was at the main house with her hairdresser, her makeup artist, her 2 best friends, 2 bottles of champagne whose corks would not come out until the photographer arrived, and a quiet, far-away look that Iris caught only once when she went up to confirm the timing. "Calloway," Camille said, sitting at the dressing table in a white robe, her hair pinned in 3 precise loops. "Are we on schedule?" "We are 42 minutes ahead, Miss Hartley." "That is not what I asked." Iris paused in the doorway. "I asked," Camille said, looking at her own reflection, "whether we are on schedule." There was something in her voice that Iris had not heard before. It was not cruel. It was not bored. It was, Iris thought with a small, startled honesty, tired. The kind of tired a person becomes when they have been performing for a very long time. "Miss Hartley, we are on schedule." "Good. Is there anything you need?" Camille looked at her in the mirror. Their eyes met in the glass. For a long moment Camille did not answer, and then she said, very softly, "Tell my mother I would like 10 minutes alone." "Yes, Miss Hartley." "Calloway?" "Yes." "You are very good at your job." "Thank you, Miss Hartley." "That was a compliment. I do not give them often. Please accept it." "I do." Iris closed the door behind her and went down the stairs. She found Vivian in the orangery, conferring with the photographer. She delivered the message. Vivian was annoyed. Iris weathered the annoyance. She went out to the lawn. Sebastian was on the rear terrace. He was alone. He was already in his suit, which was a deep midnight blue, almost black, and he stood with his back to the house and his face to the meadow, and he was watching the rows of empty chairs, as if reading a long sentence in a language he had once known and had not spoken in years. She did not approach him. She had decided on the lawn the night before that she would not approach him today. Her approach today was to make the day move forward. Her approach today was the clipboard. But he turned slightly, and he saw her, and he raised one hand in greeting, and she lifted hers. That was all.
He did not come to her. She did not go to him. They did, however, hold the look across the lawn for a count that was longer than professional and shorter than improper. And then Felix appeared at her elbow with a question about the seating chart, and the moment closed, and the day moved on. By 4, the guests had begun to arrive in earnest, in slow, glittering pairs along the gravel drive. Iris stood by the small refreshment table on the front lawn and directed the seating attendants and the parking attendants and the small army of cousins who had been given lists and lanyards. Felix was on the rear terrace. The orchestra began to tune. Helena Vance arrived in lavender grey silk and pearls, on the arm of her younger daughter Margot, who was 26 and looked exactly like her brother around the eyes. Margot caught Iris's gaze and gave her a small, conspiratorial smile, the smile of one capable woman to another. And Iris felt, briefly, less alone in the house than she had felt for 3 weeks. By 5:15, the guests were seated. By 5:30, the orchestra was playing the soft, pre-ceremony pieces Iris had chosen herself, 2 Bach airs and a gentle modern thing. By 5:50, the officiant was in place. By 6, Iris was at the back of the chair rows with Felix, with her earpiece on, with her clipboard, with her heart, very privately, in the middle of her own chest like a stone. At 6:12, Camille stepped out onto the rear terrace. She was a vision. The dress was ivory and minimal, with a long, slow train and a square neckline that caught the gold of the sun, and her hair was up, and her veil was simple, and the photographers, true to Iris's quiet promise 3 weeks earlier, audibly inhaled. The light was on the line between the second and third columns. Camille was backlit. The world held its breath. She walked. Sebastian was at the arch, his hands folded loosely in front of him, watching her come. He did not, Iris noticed, smile. He did not, Iris noticed, frown. He looked, instead, like a man witnessing something carefully arranged on his behalf, the way a man looks at a portrait someone has commissioned without asking him. The walk was 32 steps. Iris counted them without meaning to. The vows began. The officiant was a soft-voiced man in a dark suit, and he spoke for 3 minutes about marriage as a covenant of patience, and then he turned, gently, to Sebastian. "Sebastian Edward Vance, will you have this woman to be your wife?" Sebastian did not answer immediately. The pause was, in clock time, perhaps 2 seconds. In wedding time, it was geological. Iris saw Camille's shoulders very slightly lift. She saw Vivian Hartley, in the front row, turn her head a fraction toward her daughter. She saw Helena Vance close her eyes. Then Sebastian said, very steadily, "I will." The officiant turned to Camille. "Camille Eleanor Hartley, will you have this man to be your husband?" Camille looked at Sebastian. She looked at him for the longest moment of the day. And in that moment, Iris saw, with a sudden clarity that startled her, that Camille knew everything, had known, perhaps, for longer than anyone, knew that this man would marry her if she said yes, would do so with grace, would do so with honor, and would also not love her, would never love her, would dance the first dance with her at 8:15 as a public pledge that would mean very little to him and very much to the cameras. And Iris saw, in that same moment, that Camille was thinking, in the strange, clear way one thinks at altars, "I could let him." But Camille said, "I will." The vows continued. The rings were exchanged. The officiant pronounced. Sebastian leaned, and he kissed Camille on the cheek, not on the mouth. And the audience applauded politely, and the photographers fired, and Iris, at the back of the chair rows, made a small mark on her clipboard at 6:26. 2 minutes ahead of plan. Then the recessional began, and the bride and the groom walked back up the aisle in soft, golden light. And Iris and Felix went into motion to move 280 guests off the lawn and into the rear ballroom, where the cocktails were already poured, and the canapes were already on trays, and the orchestra was already playing the slower pieces, and the great machine of the wedding hummed on, and the day was on schedule.
and the day was beautiful. And the day was a Hartley wedding. And at the end of it, there would be the first dance. The cocktail hour was 34 minutes, the shortest the Hartleys had ever allowed, because Vivian had agreed, against her own preference, that a 612-person dinner would not seat itself if she did not let it begin. Iris worked the room from the perimeter. She watched the bride and the groom move through the crowd with the slow, separate ease of two people who had been told to mingle and were doing so on parallel tracks. Sebastian's mother stayed close to Anne. Camille's mother stayed close to her. The two mothers did not speak to each other. The Hartleys had brought a small entourage. The Vances had a smaller one. Margot Vance moved among both groups with grace and made everyone slightly less nervous, which is, Iris thought, the highest possible function of a sister. At 7, dinner was called, and the guests filtered into the long, white-clothed hall, and the first 3 courses were served, and the toasts began. The father of the bride spoke first. His speech was practiced and proud and full of the sort of gentle business jokes that play well in such rooms. Helena Vance spoke second. Her speech was very short. She said, "Sebastian, Camille, may this be the beginning of a long, useful, quiet life." And she sat down, and the room applauded, uncertain whether to laugh. Margot was meant to speak third, but the order moved. Iris saw Sebastian, at the head table, lean over and murmur something to the toastmaster, and the toastmaster nodded, and the toastmaster bent to the microphone and announced, in the warm voice toastmasters reserve for these moments, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, to start the evening properly, we will move to the first dance, after which we will have the rest of our toasts, including a special word from the groom." Iris felt in her earpiece Felix say sharply, "Iris, the order." "I see it, Felix." "That was not the order." "I see it, Felix. Hold." The orchestra had been instructed to begin the first dance music at 8:15. It was now 7:48. The conductor was looking, panicked, at the toastmaster, and the toastmaster was looking at Sebastian. Sebastian stood. He stood very slowly. He buttoned the top button of his jacket. He stepped out from behind the table. He walked, not to the dance floor, but to the microphone, which was on a small stand at the edge of the floor, and he took the microphone from its stand, and he turned and faced the room. The room quieted, the way a room quiets when a man at his own wedding takes the microphone. He said, "Forgive me. Before the first dance, I would like to say something." He said, "I've been told all my life that the first dance is the photograph everyone remembers. Mine, my parents, my grandparents, today's. I've been told that this is the moment the marriage begins. I've been told it is the moment the husband chooses the wife in front of the room." He paused. "I would like to be honest with you, with all of you, with the people in this room who have come a long way today, and the people who flew across the country, and the people who only sometimes come to weddings, and have come to ours." Vivian Hartley, in the front row, set down her glass. Helena Vance, at the head table, did not move. Sebastian said, "I have been a coward for many months. I have allowed an arrangement to walk me toward an altar I did not, in my own heart, intend to walk to. I did so because I was tired, and because I had been raised to be useful before I was raised to be honest, and because the people who love me, in their way, asked me to. And I said yes to all of it. And today I stood at that altar and said yes again. And I should not have." Camille, at the head table, was very still. But she was also, Iris saw, watching Sebastian with a calm, almost respectful attention. The way one watches a person finally do a difficult thing one has been waiting for them to do. "Camille," Sebastian said, turning to her, "I owe you the first apology of my life. You are an extraordinary woman. You deserve to be chosen. I did not choose you. I let myself be moved toward you by men in offices and women in fitting rooms. That is not a marriage, that is a contract. You knew it, I knew it, and neither of us, until now,
was brave enough to say it out loud. He paused. Then he said, gently, "If you will allow me, in the morning, we will speak quietly with our families and with the appropriate counsel, and we will undo the legal piece of today as kindly as we can. The rest of the evening, the food and the music and the friendship, I would like, if you will allow me, to continue. Because the people in this room came a long way, and they came in love, and they should not be punished because the groom finally found his courage." The room did not move. Camille, after a moment, stood. She walked slowly to the microphone. She took it from his hand. She did not speak immediately. She looked at him. She looked at the room. She looked, briefly, across the ballroom to where Iris was standing with her clipboard at her chest like a small, useless shield. Then Camille said, into the microphone, with a steadiness that startled even her own family, "Thank you, Sebastian." Her voice was clear. "I will accept that apology, and I will offer my own. I too was tired. I too was raised to be photographed before I was raised to be loved. I too knew what we were and did not say so. We did not fail today. We told the truth today. That, in my family, is something of a first." She set the microphone down. She walked, with an absolute composure that Iris would remember for the rest of her life, back to her seat. She sat. She lifted her glass. She gave a small, dry, almost amused look to her mother, who was the color of paper, and she said, in the same clear voice, loud enough for her mother and the front row, "Mother, sit down. The day is fine." Vivian Hartley sat down. Sebastian did not pick up the microphone again. He did not return to his seat. He stood in the middle of the white floor in the ballroom, in his midnight blue suit, and he turned, slowly, and he looked across the room until he found Iris where she stood, against the back wall, with her clipboard, and her earpiece, and her own quiet face. He walked. He walked across the white floor. He walked past the head table. He walked past Helena Vance, who did not look up. He walked past Margot, who reached out and brushed his hand briefly as he passed. And the brush of her hand was, Iris saw, the only blessing he received that night from the family that had raised him. He walked all the way across the room to where Iris stood, and he stopped a respectful distance from her, and the room watched him do it. He said, quietly, only to her, "Iris, Sebastian, I would like to ask you a question. I would like to ask it now, not because I am sure of the answer, but because I am sure I cannot live another hour without asking it." "Ask." "3 weeks ago," he said, "I asked you to plan an hour that was mine. I told you I would not use it. I have used it tonight. I would like, if you will allow me, to use the rest of my hours the way I used this one. I would like to choose. I would like to choose you. I do not know yet whether you can choose me back. I do not deserve a quick answer, and I am not asking for one. I am only asking to ask." She looked at him. She looked at the man who had taken the microphone at his own wedding and chosen, in front of 612 people, to tell the truth. She looked at the place behind his face. She felt the cream card and the second sheet of paper in the inside pocket of her notebook, and the long, quiet hour she'd carried up the stairs to her tiny apartment for 3 weeks. She said, "Sebastian, this is not the night you ask me that." He did not flinch. He nodded, slowly. "No, you are right. This is the night you sit with the people you have loved, and the people you have hurt, and the family who raised you, and the woman who just gave you the most generous answer of her life. This is the night you take care of all of that. Not me." "Yes." "When that is done, when the dust settles, when the lawyers and the families and the press are managed, and there is no audience for the answer, you may find me." "I will." "I do not promise an answer. I know."
I only promised to listen. That is more than I had any right to ask for. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she said, in her professional voice, the voice of the woman with the clipboard, "Mr. Vance, the cake is in the kitchen. The orchestra is waiting. You owe these people a party. Please go and give it to them." A small, surprised, almost laughing breath came out of him. He said, "Yes, Miss Calloway." He turned, and he walked back across the floor. And he did not, that night, dance with Iris. And he did not, that night, dance with Camille. But he gave the room a party, and the room gave it back. And Margot Vance toasted her brother with a glass, raised at exactly the right angle for the photographers. And Camille Hartley toasted Sebastian with a smile that surprised her own face. And Iris stood at the back, and she did her job. And at midnight, the last of the guests went up the gravel drive in their long black cars. And Iris and Felix sat down on the front steps of the Hartley estate. And Iris took her shoes off. And Felix said, very quietly, "Iris, don't. Iris, Felix, please. Not yet." He did not say the thing he was going to say. He sat with her instead. They watched the stars come out over the meadow. Somewhere in the house, behind several closed doors, a Hartley and a Vance were each, in their own way, having the conversations that needed to happen. And on the steps, an exhausted wedding planner in a black dress and flat shoes was holding her clipboard against her stomach the way a person holds a small, warm thing. And she was, very quietly, finally, allowing herself to feel something. Felix said, eventually, "He chose you. He chose the truth. And the truth chose you." She did not answer. She did not have to. There was an hour that night, after the last car had gone up the gravel drive, that nobody photographed. There was the hum of the catering staff packing up. There was the soft, exhausted laughter of two waiters folding chairs. There was Felix on the front step beside Iris, in his charcoal suit, with his tie loose, with his shoes off too, looking up at the stars over the meadow. There was the smell of cut grass and salt air. There was the cool of the marble step under the backs of Iris's bare ankles. There was a long stretch of silence between two people who had worked together for 5 years and could afford to spend a silence the way other people spent words. There was, somewhere far inside the house, behind several closed doors, the muffled sound of Helena Vance speaking to her son in the voice she used only for him. There was, somewhere on the second floor, Vivian Hartley speaking to her daughter in a different voice. There was, in the kitchen, a young server quietly throwing away the half-eaten plates of the head table. There was, on the dance floor that nobody had danced on, a single white peony that had fallen from a centerpiece and that nobody had picked up. There was the faint hum of a generator in the side garden. There was the small, slow ticking of the cooling caterer's van. There was a heron, somewhere on the dunes, calling once. There was the long white runner of the aisle, still laid on the lawn, going pearl grey in the moonlight. There was Iris on the step, with her clipboard against her chest like a small, warm thing. There was the absence of a question. There was the presence of an answer that had not yet been asked for. There was the cool of the spring night. There was, very quietly, the sound of a man closing a door somewhere on the upper floor of the house. And the sound was final. And the sound was not unkind. And the sound, Iris understood without being able to explain how, was the sound of a marriage that had lasted 6 minutes, very gently and very thoroughly, being put to bed. She slept on the train back into the city the next morning, on Felix's shoulder, while the meadows of Long Island moved past the window in long, unhurried bands of green and grey. Felix did not wake her. Felix sat very still, with his coffee in his free hand and her clipboard balanced on his knee, and watched the world arrive at the city slowly, the way it always did from that direction. He did not look at her face. He did not need to. He had known her for 5 years. He had known what she had decided on the lawn the night before, within an hour of her getting back into the car. He had decided, somewhere around the second exit, that he would not say a word about any of it
for at least a week. And that, when the week was up, he would only ever say what she asked him to say, and not one syllable more. Iris would, in later years, count Felix's silence on that train ride as one of the great gifts of her professional life. There were people, she would tell young planners much later, who would always tell you what they thought of you. Those people were useful in their way, but there were also people, rarer and more precious, who would sit in the next seat with a coffee and a clipboard, and let you arrive at your own conclusions in your own time. Those, she would tell the young planners, were the people you kept. Those were the people you did not, under any circumstance, lose. In the morning, the press exploded. It exploded because Vivian Hartley made one phone call to one columnist before sunrise, in which she said only, "There has been a kindness of spirit." And that single sentence, more than any official statement, set the tone for what was to come. The Hartleys, it turned out, did not require the wedding for their spring quarter. The Vances, it turned out, did not require the wedding at all. The financial papers ran small, careful items. The society papers ran kinder ones. By the end of the first week, a quiet, gentle annulment was filed and signed, and Camille Hartley flew to Lisbon for what her own people called a holiday, and her closest people called a beginning. And Helena Vance went into the country for a month and refused to take her son's calls. And Sebastian Vance returned to his glass office on the 47th floor of Vance Tower and sat at his desk and looked at the city and did not telephone Iris Calloway. Not in the first week. Not in the second. Iris understood. Iris did her work. She and Felix took on 3 new clients and a small launch event for a children's literacy charity, which they did at cost. The bakery downstairs began baking a new bread, a soft, enriched loaf with cardamom and honey, which they named, with no help from Iris, the Calloway. Iris went home each night to her apartment in Park Slope and watered the small herbs on her balcony and read whatever book she had left half-read on the nightstand. The cream card and the second sheet of paper stayed in the inside pocket of her notebook, which she carried, as always, everywhere. There were small things, in those 3 weeks, that nobody photographed. There was Sebastian, alone in the glass office on the 47th floor on the second Saturday after the wedding, in shirt sleeves, with the city laid out below him like an enormous lit map of every place he had not yet been kind enough to anyone. He sat for a long time. He did not work. He did not, that afternoon, even open the laptop on his desk. He looked at the small paper crane on the corner of the desk, and he looked at the city, and he looked at the crane again. He thought about a woman walking through the dark with a candelabrum. He thought about a woman sitting on the steps of a Hartley estate at midnight with her shoes off. He thought, with the first clear thought he had had about himself in 8 years, that he had been, for a long time, a man waiting to be permitted to feel something, and that no one was ever going to issue the permission, and that the permission, if he wanted it, would have to be granted by himself, in private, on a Saturday afternoon, in a glass office, by a man who was tired of waiting. He granted it. He did not telephone Iris that day. He had said he would not. He kept the promise. He did, however, write her name on a clean piece of paper, in his own steady hand, and he sat with the piece of paper for a while, and he understood, looking at it, that the name was the only thing he had written by hand in 2 years that he had not also signed with a corporate title underneath. He folded the paper. He put it in his jacket pocket. Then he went home, on foot, through the long blue spring evening, all the way down the avenue, past the people coming out of restaurants, past the doormen of buildings he did not own, past a small bakery whose lights were still on at 7, though it was a Saturday, and he thought, briefly, of the bakery downstairs from her office, and he kept walking. Iris had a different week. She had 3 new clients. She had a small launch event for a children's literacy charity, which she had agreed to plan at cost. She had, on Tuesday, a meeting with a couple from the Upper West Side who had been engaged for 6 years, and who had brought, in a manila envelope, 3 different deposits they had paid and lost over those 6 years to 3 different planners, and who had said, after one quiet hour with Iris, that they thought they could finally believe in their own wedding again. She did not tell anyone that her own week was a soft and patient kind of waiting. She did not tell Felix. She did not tell her mother. She told only the small herbs on her balcony, late at night when she watered them, and the herbs were good listeners. There were the lights of the bridges. There was the soft, far-off rumble of the trains. There was, on the Wednesday of that second week, a single white envelope that arrived at the office above the bakery from a Hartley address, addressed in Camille's own hand. Inside was a single line. "I think you are good at your job, Calloway. And I think you are good at your life. And I think you should be allowed both. C." Iris read the line 3 times, and she put the card in the inside pocket of her notebook, beside the cream card from Sebastian, and the second sheet of paper she had written at 3 in the morning. And she did not, that night, water the herbs, because she felt, in the middle of her chest, the small, unexpected warmth of a generosity she had not asked for. There was Felix, who said nothing and brought her coffee. There was Margot Vance, who did not write because she had been told by her brother not to interfere, and who therefore did not interfere, and whose silence Iris understood, at a distance, as the most considerate possible kind of presence. There was Helena Vance, who did not write at all, and whose absence Iris understood, also at a distance, as the most honest possible kind of presence she could offer at that hour of her own grief. There were 3 small dinners with Iris's mother by phone, in which her mother did not ask the question Iris was waiting to be asked, and in which Iris was, for the first time in her adult life, grateful for that particular omission. There was the city in its second spring of the year, the one that arrives in late April after the first false spring of March, the spring that finally takes hold. The spring in which the light at 6 in the evening is no longer the cold, thin light of winter, and is, instead, a soft, golden light that lingers on the limestone of old buildings, and on the new green of the small trees in the brick planters, and on the faces of strangers walking home. Iris walked home in that light every evening. She did not, every evening, hurry. She let the light find her. She thought of him often. She did not pretend not to. In the 3rd week, on a Tuesday, a small white envelope arrived at the office above the bakery. It was hand-delivered. It contained a single piece of cream card, on which was written, in a hand she now recognized, "Miss Calloway, I am sitting at my desk. The dust is settling. I have not telephoned because I did not want the first thing I asked of you to be your time. I am asking now." There is a small dock at the end of a quiet road in Cold Spring, on the Hudson, an hour and a half north of the city. There is a bench at the end of the dock. I will be there on Saturday at 6. I will sit on the bench until 8. If you do not come, I will not write again. If you come, I will not have prepared anything to say. I will only listen to whatever you wish to say, and I will tell you, in plain words, what I have understood about myself in these 3 weeks. I will not propose anything. I will not ask anything. I will only sit and tell the truth. Sebastian. She read the card twice. She put it in the inside pocket of her notebook, beside the first card and the second sheet of paper. She went home that night, and she did not tell Felix. On Saturday morning, she rented a car. She drove north along the Hudson, on a road she had never driven before, through small towns whose names she did not know, past orchards and ridges, and the long blue sweep of the river. She arrived at Cold Spring at 5:45. She parked. She walked to the dock. He was already there. He was sitting on the bench, in jeans and a soft grey sweater, with his elbows on his knees, looking at the water. He did not have a coat. He looked, against the cool gold of the late afternoon, like a man who had walked a great distance and was only now sitting down. She walked to the bench. She did not sit immediately. She stood at his shoulder. "Sebastian." "Iris." "You are early." "I've been early for 3 weeks." She sat, not close, not far. The wood of the bench was warm from the afternoon sun. The river moved slowly in front of them, the way wide rivers do,
in patient, unhurried wait. For a long while, neither of them spoke. A heron moved at the edge of the reeds. A small motorboat passed in the middle of the river. The sun lowered. Finally, Sebastian said, "May I tell you what I have understood?" "Please." "I have understood that I have spent 15 years being a useful son and a useful CEO, and an entirely useless human being. I have understood that I knew this for at least the last 5 of those years, and I did nothing about it, because I was afraid that if I did one true thing, my mother would never forgive me. I have understood in these 3 weeks that my mother loves me, and that she will, eventually, forgive me, and that even if she does not, the price of her forgiveness was no longer a price I could afford. I have understood that I almost married a woman I respected and did not love, because the alternative was admitting that I was lonely. I have understood that I have been lonely since my father went away, which was 8 years ago, and that I taught myself to call the loneliness discipline, and then composure, and then, finally, success." He paused. He looked at the water. "I've understood," he said, "that the night the lights went out at the rehearsal dinner, I watched a woman walk through the dark with a candelabrum in her hand, and that what I felt was not gratitude. It was not admiration. It was not, even, attraction, which would have been a simpler feeling and would have been easier to dismiss. It was recognition. I recognized you, Iris. I recognized the way you moved through that dark. I knew it. I had been moving through it myself for years. I had only never met anyone else who had done it on purpose." He stopped. He looked at her. "That is what I understood. I am not asking anything of you. I am only telling you. If you would now like to leave, you may. If you would like to stay, I would like to listen. I will not interrupt. I will not press. I will not, today, say anything more about myself. I have, finally, said enough." Iris was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "May I tell you what I have understood?" "Yes." "I have understood that I planned other people's weddings for 10 years because I was afraid to want one of my own. I have understood that I held a folder marked personal in my office for 3 weeks and put a single sheet of paper in it because I did not know how else to give myself permission to want something. I have understood that the night you walked me to Felix's car on the lawn, you asked me a question I had been waiting my whole life to be asked by someone who meant it. I have understood that I would not have answered yes today, 3 weeks ago, even if you had divorced your mother and stood on the roof of your building. I would not have trusted it. I needed 3 weeks, Sebastian. I needed to see what you would do when there was no audience, and no orchestra, and no microphone. I needed to see whether you would write. I needed to see whether you would sit on a bench." He looked at her. He waited. "You wrote," she said, "and you sat on the bench." She turned to him. She was not crying. She did not, ever, cry about other people's mothers, or about offices, or about benches. But she felt, in the middle of her own chest, a long, slow loosening, the way one feels a garden loosen at the end of winter, before any green has yet shown. "I am not going to give you an answer today, Sebastian. I did not ask for one. I know. That is why I will tell you what I will give you instead. I will give you my Saturdays. For as long as you want to come and sit on a bench, I will come. We will be slow. We will be private. We will not, for a while, be in any newspaper. We will be 2 people on benches and on docks and in small towns. If, at some point, I look at you on a bench and I know the answer, I will tell you. Until then, you have my Saturdays, and I have yours." "Yes." "Yes. Yes," he said, very quietly. "All my Saturdays. From this one." She allowed herself, for the first time that afternoon, to reach across the bench and put her hand gently on his. It was a small thing. It was the smallest thing 2 people can do on a bench.
He looked down at her hand. He turned his hand under hers, slowly, and his palm met her palm, and his fingers closed around hers with a care that was unlike anything in the tower or the meadow or the ballroom. It was the care of a man choosing. The sun went down behind the ridge across the river. The water went the color of pewter, and then the color of slate, and then the color of the sky after the sun has gone, which is no color at all, and contains, somehow, every other color. They sat until the first stars came out, and they did not speak again that evening, except once, near the end, when Iris said, "You should have a coat next time." And Sebastian said, "Yes, Miss Calloway." And she laughed, in the dark, on the bench beside the long, quiet river. The laugh came out of her like a bird coming out of an old room. She had not heard the sound in years, and she discovered in the hearing that she had missed it. There was, of course, a great deal that did not show on the bench. There was a great deal of work, on Sebastian's side, of unwinding 8 years of being a man on autopilot. There was the long, slow conversation with the firm's board, and the longer, slower conversation with the family lawyer. There was the longest, slowest conversation of all, which Sebastian had with himself in his glass office on the 47th floor, at hours when nobody else was on the floor, sitting in his chair, with the city below him like a circuit board, lit up for someone else's birthday. He kept the small paper crane on the corner of his desk. He looked at it sometimes for a long time. He did not, in those months, telephone Iris between Saturdays, because he had said he would not, and because he had decided, in those quiet evenings in the glass office, that the most useful thing he could give her was the precise gift she had asked for, and not 1 minute more or less. He had spent his whole life giving people what they had not asked for. He intended now to learn the smaller and harder art of giving people what they had. There was a great deal, too, on Iris's side. There was the work of the office above the bakery. There was a wedding in Westchester for a doctor and a violinist that Iris poured herself into, the way one pours oneself into a kettle. There was a small evening where Iris's mother flew in from Ohio and stayed for 4 days and asked, on the third evening, gently, whether her daughter had met anyone. Iris had said, "Yes, Mamma," and her mother had nodded once and asked no further questions, because her mother was the kind of woman who could be told the truth and asked to keep it. There was a Thursday in early summer when Iris stood at the window of her office above the bakery and watched a young couple come out of the shop downstairs with 2 coffees and a single chocolate croissant. She watched the young woman break the croissant in half with her hands and give the larger half to the young man. She felt, in the middle of her chest, the small, new, clean fact that she had, finally, after a great deal of waiting, allowed herself to want such a Thursday for herself. The Saturdays became weeks. The weeks became months. By summer, they were taking trains together. By autumn, they were walking through the small farmers' markets of small Hudson Valley towns, choosing apples and arguing pleasantly about whether the Honeycrisp was an honest apple. Felix met Sebastian on a bright Sunday in October and reported back to Iris in a single text message of exactly 4 words. He did not flinch. Iris understood that this was Felix's highest possible endorsement, and she did not request elaboration. Margot Vance came to dinner at Iris's small apartment in November. She brought a bottle of wine and a paper bag of pastries from the bakery downstairs. She sat on the small couch and she cried, briefly, at the kitchen counter. And Iris let her cry. And afterward, Margot said, "I have not seen him laugh in 8 years, Iris." "He laughs?" "He laughs." "At what?" "At everything you say, even when it is not funny." "That is not a compliment, Margot." "It is the only compliment I have to give. Take it." Iris took it. She put her arm around Margot's shoulder, and Margot, who looked exactly like her brother around the eyes, leaned her head briefly against Iris's, and the 2 of them sat, in a small kitchen above a bakery, watching the lights of Brooklyn come on through the window. And Iris understood, with a quiet certainty, that the family she was being given was a small and unusual one. and that it would be enough. Helena Vance took longer. Helena did not telephone her son for 2 months after the wedding that was not. Then she did. The conversation was brief. She did not apologize. She did not ask about Iris. She asked only one thing: whether her son was well. Sebastian said, after a small pause, "Yes, Mother, I am well." Helena said, "Good," and ended the call. Sebastian told Iris about the call that Saturday on the bench. Iris said, "She will come around in her own time." Sebastian said, "She may not." Iris said, "Then she may not. We will be all right." He looked at her on the bench, and he said, "We." And she felt the word the way one feels a small new country. By Christmas, Helena had sent a card. The card was a single line: "I expect you both at the country house for the new year. Bring her with you. HV." Sebastian read it 3 times. Iris said, "Sebastian, breathe." He breathed. They went to the country house. Helena did not embrace Iris. She did, however, ask her, on the second morning, whether she would like to walk in the garden, and the walk lasted for 40 minutes. And afterward, Helena said, looking at the bare apple trees, "You are not what I would have chosen, Miss Calloway." Iris said, "I know, Mrs. Vance." Helena said, "He is happier than I have seen him in 10 years. Iris said, "I know that too." Helena said, "Then we will, in our way, get along." That, in Helena Vance's vocabulary, was an embrace. There were small things in those months that Iris would later remember more sharply than she remembered the wedding that was not. There was the morning in February when Sebastian had taken her to a small hardware store in Garrison because he had decided, on the previous Saturday, that he wanted to learn how to fix a particular kind of door hinge that had been squeaking in his apartment, and that he intended to fix it himself, and that he wanted her opinion on the screws. There was the afternoon in late February when Iris had taken him, in turn, to her mother's house in Ohio. On a quick weekend visit, her mother had called only the practice run. Her mother had served him a very plain pot roast and asked him 3 direct questions about his work, and 1 direct question about his sister, and 0 questions about his bank balance. Sebastian had answered all 4 with the careful seriousness of a man taking an oral exam he had been preparing for since boyhood. Iris's mother had washed dishes that night and dried them with a tea towel and said, in passing, "Iris, he is a kind man." It was the most extravagant thing Iris's mother had ever said about a stranger in Iris's life. Iris had not corrected the word stranger. She had, instead, taken the towel out of her mother's hand and finished the drying and said nothing at all, and her mother had not pressed. In March, Sebastian asked Iris a question on a bench in Cold Spring. He did not kneel. He did not produce a velvet box. He simply turned to her on the bench, in a long grey coat she had bought him in November, when he had finally taken her advice about coats. And he said, "Iris, I have a small house in Vermont. It belonged to my grandmother. It has been empty for 11 years. I would like, if you will, to ask you to marry me there in May, in a garden, with my sister and your mother and Felix, and 4 other people. I will not ask anyone else. I will not invite a press list. I will not invite my mother unless you want her there. I would like the day to be ours." She looked at him. She said, "Will there be a first dance?" "Only if you would like one." "I would like one. I have planned 89 of them. I would like one of my own." "Then there will be one." She put her hand on his hand on the bench. She said, "Sebastian." "Yes." The garden in Vermont was small. The trees were old. The grass was tender, new green, and the air was cool, and the sky was the kind of pale, soft blue that mornings have, only when no one has spent the morning hurrying. Iris's mother was there, in a soft lilac dress. Felix was there, in a charcoal suit, weeping intermittently and unapologetically.
Margot was there in green, with her own quiet smile. 3 close friends of Iris's filled the rest of the small lawn. One of Sebastian's college friends, a doctor named Andrew, stood with him at the small, simple arch. Iris wore an ivory dress that she had borrowed from a friend who had worn it 5 years earlier. Sebastian wore linen. There were no photographers. There was no press list. There was, however, a small string trio playing softly under the old oak at the end of the garden, and there were paper lanterns hung along the path, and Felix had baked, by hand, the cake himself, a soft crumb honey cake with cardamom, made from the bakery's own recipe, which he had named, with perfect insouciance, the Callaway Vance. The vows were short. They were not memorized. Sebastian said, "Iris, I chose you in front of the wrong room a year ago, and I am choosing you again in front of the right one. I will choose you on every Saturday of my life. I will choose you on the Tuesdays and the Thursdays as well." Iris said, "Sebastian, I planned an hour for you once that I thought you would not use. You used it. I have planned the rest of my hours for myself, and I would like, very much, to use them with you." The officiant, who was Margot, who had become ordained for the occasion in a small online ceremony she had treated with great seriousness, pronounced them married. They kissed, briefly and gently, and the small lawn applauded, and Felix wept harder. Then the trio struck up something soft and slow. Sebastian held out his hand. "Miss Callaway." "Mr. Vance." "May I have the first dance?" "You may." He led her under the old oak, onto the small patch of grass that had been marked, by Felix that morning, with a circle of white river stones the size of plums. She stepped into his arms. He held her the way he had held her hand on the bench in Cold Spring on the first night, with the care of a man choosing. He did not look at the trio. He did not look at Felix. He looked at her. Only her. They danced, slowly, on the grass. The light was on the line between 2 old apple trees. The light was, she noticed, exactly the kind of light Camille Hartley had once asked for. Exactly the kind of light Iris herself had once promised photographers would weep over. Exactly the kind of light that no photographers were here to see. It was, Iris thought, the most expensive light she had ever stood in, because no one had paid for it. It had simply come. Sebastian leaned down. He spoke into her hair. "Iris." "Yes." "I told you, on a lawn in East Hampton, that I had been a man drowning in plain sight." "I remember." "I am no longer drowning." "I know." "You were the lights coming back on." "I know that too." He smiled. It was a full smile this time. It moved across his whole face, and it reached his eyes, the lake-grey eyes. And the lake-grey eyes were no longer winter, were not, in fact, any season she had a name for. They were simply his, and they were looking at her, and they were home. The trio finished the song. Margot raised her glass. Iris's mother wept quietly into a handkerchief. Felix called out, "I made the cake! Come to the cake!" And the small lawn laughed, and the sun moved, and the day moved on. Many years later, when Iris was asked, by a young wedding planner she had taken on as an apprentice in the Brooklyn office, whether she had ever planned a wedding she would not forget, she did not tell the story of the Hartley estate, or the lights going out, or the man at the microphone. She told a different story. She told the story of an hour, marked simply as personal, on a folder on her desk in 3 weeks of impossible work. She told the apprentice that, in every wedding the apprentice would ever plan, she should leave 1 hour blank on the schedule, with no name beside it and no plan inside it, and call it personal, and offer it quietly to the bride and the groom. "They will mostly not use it," Iris said, "but sometimes one of them will, and the one who uses it will, sometimes, find their way to the other side of an entire life because of it." The apprentice asked, gently, whether Iris had ever used such an hour herself.
Iris smiled. She thought, briefly, of a bench at Cold Spring, of a long, quiet river going pewter and then slate, and then the color of every star, of a man putting his palm under hers, of a small lawn in Vermont, of an oak tree, of a circle of white river stones, of a husband, very slowly, learning to laugh. Yes, Iris said. Once. It was the most useful hour of my life. And outside the window, on Fifth Avenue in Brooklyn, the afternoon sun was on the bakery awning, and the bakery downstairs was, as it had been for many years, baking the loaf they still called the Callaway. And the apprentice opened her notebook, and she wrote, in her own careful hand, on a fresh page, a single line. 1 hour. Sunset. Private. Optional. And then, beneath it, almost without thinking, she wrote, Begin.